Hello, and thank you for coming along once again. Today we're going to look at debt imperialism in America and Africa with some historical notes on the rise and fall of the American Empire on Independence Day today, the 4th of July, 2021. We're going to look back a bit at American colonial history and look at the origins of America's fear of debt with the founding fathers like John Adams. Further, we're going to look ahead to contemporary circumstances and look at the secret history of American empire. How economic hitmen like John Perkins served to expand the corporate interests and American influence around the world through the use of debt in a new kind of debt imperialism. To begin with, we can look back through the American history on the 4th of July thanks to the National Archives Foundation, which has put together from the National Archives a series of dramatizations of the early colonial period, what led up to the Revolutionary War. It's been put together by a series of actors in a sequence of historical reenactments by the American Historical Theater. This one deals with Patrick Henry and his position in the acts of rebellion against the Stamp Act and the Townshend Act passed by the British to increase their income. As the National Archive broadcast explains, in the 1760s, Parliament redoubled their efforts to raise revenue for the British Crown, enacting legislation which Americans saw as being specifically directed to impose unlawful taxation on the American colonies. Patrick Henry, and then later John Dickinson, provide a closer examination of the Stamp Act and Townshend Acts in this reenactment. Let's take a look and listen to the way in which Patrick Henry, reenacted here by Bob Gleason, articulated the problem at the time.
Hello, I'm Patrick Henry, lawyer, member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, delegate to the First Continental Congress, 6 times governor of Virginia, husband, father, farmer, fiddle player. I have been asked to tell you about the Stamp Act of 1765. This is the story. Once upon a time, England won the 7 Years' War. That was their first mistake. In America, it was called the French and Indian War, but it was still a mistake. Wars cost a lot of money, and that war nearly doubled England's national debt. It also left them with a very large army with nothing to do but eat, and a lot of officers who were used to eating very well. They couldn't take them back to England because armies are supposed to be somewhere else defending England, not marching around England getting into mischief. So they decided to leave them in America to defend the frontier, they said. But they still had to be fed and clothed and housed, and that cost money that King George didn't have. Now, when a government needs money, the first thing they do is raise taxes. However, the English Parliament didn't want to raise taxes in England. That would make the English people unhappy, and unhappy people don't vote for you. But the American colonies weren't allowed to vote, so why not tax them instead? After all, England had spent a lot of money defending the colonies during the French and Indian War, so the colonies should be grateful and help pay the debt. That was the idea anyway. I had just been elected to my first term in the Virginia House of Burgesses, our colonial governing body. I was just a young lawyer from the back country when the Stamp Act was passed by Parliament over in England. The idea of the Stamp Act was that a small fee had to be paid to attach official stamps to certain documents and paper goods like legal documents, newspapers, magazines, playing cards, attorney licenses, land grants, pamphlets, and dice. Among many other things, depending what business you were in, you would be paying a stamp fee every time you needed some sort of paper. Lawyers and college students paid the most. It seemed like the British government was trying to discourage the growth of a professional class here in America. The less smart people, the better, I suppose. To make matters worse, the stamps had to be paid for with hard currency. Gold, silver, copper, not paper money, which was about all we colonials had. Finally, the money raised was to be used to support the British Army in America and, of course, its officers who were used to living the high life. The Stamp Act was passed by the British Parliament in March of 1765 and was to go into effect in November to give them time to appoint stamp agents, to set up offices, to print the stamps and ship them over here. That gave us 7 months to think about the situation, and the more we thought about it, the less we liked it. We were being forced to support an army we had no need for. We were being compelled to pay a tax we were not allowed to vote for, and if this new tax were put into effect unopposed, what was to stop England from taxing other things? Land, produce, trade goods, and anything else people used every day. Up in Massachusetts, Samuel Adams said, "If taxes are laid upon us in any shape without our having a legal representation, are we not reduced from the character of free subjects to the miserable state of tributary slaves?"
Sam Adams, then, was among those in Boston articulating the case against the British because of the principle of no taxation without representation. Founding fathers were all very sensitive to problems of taxation and debt and the financing of colonial troops at their expense. The British had, in effect, fought a very successful war, eventually successful, in North America, known as the French and Indian War in American history, but it was known as the 7 Years' War in European history. And what happened was that the troops were left in North America and had to be paid for. They were expensive. And the British came up with the solution of passing various acts like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts to get the settlers to pay for their own defense, according to King George. These taxes were very unpopular and led ultimately to the sentiment for revolution. One of the people involved in the French and Indian Wars was George Washington himself. He fought in the Battle of Monongahela in western Pennsylvania and helped the retreating British troops avoid total disaster after their leader, Commander Braddock, had been shot and eventually died. Washington learned a lot from these frontier encounters and had a very different idea about how, in effect, new kinds of relations could be pursued along the frontier of the Indian occupation lands. It's worth going into that in detail if you have time. And it's been studied very closely in a book called The Indian World of George Washington. Basically, the intention was to expand settler control in the Western Virginia area and Pennsylvania region. They had been unsuccessful in capturing the French forts because of the Indian allies, but Washington and others wanted to pursue peaceful trade and trade in things like addictives, like tobacco itself. And the European goods, firearms, metal, coinage, and various manufactured goods which they could bring in to the coast because of the international British trade. In exchange, they'd get land and furs. They preferred to draw up treaties like this independently of the British, and once the American Revolution was successful, they began to draw up treaties like these preserved in the archives between the Shawnee Nation, the Cherokee Nation, and the new United States. These treaties can be viewed in the Library of Congress, and it's worth going over the early maps of this period, like this one put out in a collection called an American Atlas, selected from the most authentic maps, charts, and plans, published by Fade and Williams in 1777, right in the midst of the American War of Revolution. Fascinating documents in the study of the early colonial encounters. Basically, what the settlers on the East Coast had in mind, or what they called the most inhabited part of Virginia along the coastlines and the Tidewater area, accessible from the Chesapeake Bay, as well as Maryland and, of course, parts of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and North Carolina. These enclave communities along the coast could receive shipments of goods from England, and they could trade those to the interior. At the same time, the landowners in this region of the coastal accessible ports could use slave labor to produce tobacco, to trade in both directions, both back to Europe and further to the interior with Indians for pelts and access to land. Along with gunpowder and guns themselves, these were much sought after items on the frontier. Plantation owners like George Washington grew a number of crops. Some of them were foodstuffs like these wheat fields for the urban areas. But in addition, they grew tobacco. And there was a growing resentment of the British imposition of taxes to raise money for colonial troops that they thought they no longer needed. A recent study on tobacco culture looks into the mentality of the great Tidewater planters in the era of the Revolution. The study explains why the great Virginia planters embraced the revolutionary cause with so much enthusiasm. The author argues that growing indebtedness to British merchants after 1750 jeopardized the planters' traditional dominance in the area, finally precipitating a major cultural crisis, he calls it, in the years immediately preceding independence. The sentiment supporting the Revolutionary War was growing among the farmers in the Tidewater area. In New England, the elites were of a similar mind about taxes and debt. As we've heard in the presentation of the dramatic reading about the colonists in Virginia, they resented the idea of the taxes being imposed. And Sam Adams from the Boston area articulated that as well in terms of the phrase, no taxation without representation. Samuel Adams was related as a second cousin to John Adams. And this is important because John Adams becomes one of the founding fathers as well of the Revolutionary period, who had a very terse way of explaining his attitude. As he phrased it, there are two ways to conquer and enslave a nation. One is by the sword, the other is by debt. They wished to avoid indebtedness to the British merchants and the British government. It's important, and in fact crucial, to recall how important John Adams was as a founding father. Just take a look at his associations. He was born in 1735, but had an extraordinary range of associations. He was, of course, the second president of the United States, preceded by George Washington, and succeeded later by Thomas Jefferson, who was, in fact, his vice president while he was president. He was also, at the time, sent as the first minister to the United Kingdom, and there, in effect, was in office during the time that negotiations were made after the war. So he was in the position of knowing both what was going on in England and what was going on among merchants in America. And as he said and warned, there are two ways to conquer and enslave a nation. One is by the sword, the other is by debt. Well, maritime empires, which we were very familiar with in the colonies, had been considered by the European powers as kinds of empires of the weak, because they were based on very little territory, just enclaves of coastal control. This began to change dramatically in the 19th century. They were referred to as empires of the weak, and in Chinese paintings like this one, there's actually a representation of them looking at their weakness as only limited to the sea. Succeeding Adams as president, Jefferson realized the importance of continental power, and he's the one who negotiated with the French the purchase of the whole region of Louisiana. This was an important step in American history, and you can see it's a large portion. In fact, it almost doubled the settled territory. It had not yet been settled, but it opened up a massive new area of potential land expansion. And it's something that was very much sought after as a new source of resources and material and arable land for farmers wishing more fertile soil than the depleted soils that had been, in effect, ruined by the overuse in plantation agriculture, the overplanting in rapid succession year after year of things like tobacco. So this is quite an addition to America in terms of territory. What had started out as a wealth based on plantation agriculture and coastal enclaves eventually led to an expansion on the whole continent with expectations of continuous growth. Economic historians have pointed out that this is why the West has ruled for a long period, and indeed for now, as Ian Morris put it in a lecture to the Oriental Institute. This is why the West rules for now. They got used to, these settlers, a continuous abundance available from slave labor and the triangular trade. But both Jefferson and Adams were too old to witness the effective transformation to a new phase of empire in the 19th century. In fact, Quite coincidentally, both Jefferson and Adams died on the same day, the 4th of July, as it turns out, 195 years ago today. 4th of July, 1826. This was before the transformation that started to take place around the world, as there was a movement from sails to steam in the shipping industries, and this meant a move from enclave empires to ambitious continental conquest. You wanted to move into the continents from these enclaves, became the logic, to gather resources and find new markets. For this reason, there was a European-wide scramble for territory in Africa, often based on conferences thousands of miles away from Africa, and the militant action of one or two military officers who would intrude on their own initiative. Eventually, Europeans decided to carve up Africa in a series of meetings they held from November in 1874, and through February 1875. And they agreed, in effect, to divide up the territory. In other areas, as in Asia, access to markets and raw materials was achieved through what became known as gunboat diplomacy. In effect, the British introduced steam-powered ships for the first time and brought munitions with them that enabled their maneuverability, even in tight quarters, to rain down destruction on the Chinese Navy very quickly. And as a result of this gunboat diplomacy, they gained access to Hong Kong and secured control of it in a series of treaties for a 99-year lease. Very interesting idea. They didn't capture it and control it as conquered territory. They signed a lease for it with the Chinese emperor for 99 years. Seemed like an awfully long time at the time, but that 99 years has come and gone, and now Hong Kong is back in the hands of the Chinese government. The Opium Wars gave the British this 99-year lease to the port of Hong Kong, but that was all. And eventually, that was ceded back to the Chinese. The 19th century scramble in Africa led to a commitment to move onshore and develop infrastructure in the form of railroads and ports. These are permanent structures that they didn't intend to abandon or just sail away from. On the contrary, with the arrival of steamships, it now became possible to visit these ports on a regular basis, even a scheduled basis. And with rail in the interior, it became possible to bring goods down to the port on a scheduled, regular basis. The expectation of that expanded commerce became crucial. It's often referred to as a kind of railroad imperialism, because a couple of things need to be kept in mind here. You can build the infrastructure of a railroad, but that has to be financed. You have to pay for it somehow. And this drove the logic and the creation of institutions committed to perpetually extractive economies, to finance perpetually expanding infrastructure. The more you expand the infrastructure, the more you have to pay back the debt. To pay back the debt, you've got to increase the trade. And the logic became that of people like Cecil Rhodes, who began to talk about a Cape to Cairo connection, a rail system from Cairo, Egypt, down to the Cape Good Hope in South Africa. It never came to fruition in his own lifetime, but what did triumph was the idea of extractivism, that the economy should be based not on providing for the people who live there, but on the providing for a profit for those who are engaged in extracting resources from the continent. So it can be referred to as an extraordinary leap of consciousness towards extractivism as a strategy of international relations. Now, this is exactly what has been continued in a new phase, referred to often as debt imperialism. And the new scramble that's now occurring for debtor clients throughout the world. Let's take a look at how this works in places like Africa.
Today, we spend the hour with a man who claims to have worked deep inside the forces driving corporate globalization. In his first book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, John Perkins told the story of his work as a highly paid consultant hired to strong-arm leaders into creating policy favorable to the U.S. government and corporations, what he calls the corporatocracy. John Perkins says he helped the U.S. cheat poor countries around the globe out of trillions of dollars by lending them more money than they could possibly repay and then taking over their economies. John Perkins has just come out with his second book on this issue. It's called The Secret History of the American Empire, Economic Hitmen, Jackals, and the Truth About Global Corruption. John Perkins joins us now in the Firehouse studio. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Thank you, Amy. It's great to be here.
Well, before we go further, economic hitmen, for those who haven't heard you describe this, let alone describe yourself as this, what do you mean?
Well, really, I think it's fair to say that since World War II, we economic hitmen have managed to create the world's first truly global empire. And we've done it primarily without the military. Unlike other empires in history, we've done it through economics very subtly. We work many different ways, but perhaps the most common one is that we will identify a third world country that has resources our corporations covet, such as oil, and then we arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. The money never actually goes to the country. It goes instead to U.S. corporations who build big infrastructure projects, power grids, industrial parks, harbors, highways, things that benefit a few very rich people, but do not reach the poor at all. The poor aren't connected to the power grids. They don't have the skills to get jobs in industrial parks. But they and the whole country are left holding this huge debt. And it's such a big debt that the country can't possibly repay it. So at some point in time, we economic hitmen go back to that country and say, look, you know, you owe us a lot of money, you can't pay your debt, so you've got to give us a pound of flesh. We were producing these economic reports that would prove to the World Bank and would prove to Omar Torrijos that if he accepted these huge loans, then his country's gross national product would just mushroom and pull his people out of poverty. And we produced these reports, which made sense from a mathematical econometric standpoint. And in fact, it often happened that with these loans, the GNP, the gross national product, did increase. But what also was true, and what Omar knew, and Jaime Roldos knew, and I was coming to know very strongly, was that even if the general economy increased, the poor people with these loans would get poorer. The rich would make all the money because most of the poor people weren't even tied into the gross national product. A lot of them didn't even make income. They were living off subsistence farming. They benefited nothing, but they were left holding the debt. And because of these huge debts, their country in the long term would not be able to provide them with health care, education, and other social services.
Talk about Congo.
Oh boy, the whole story of Africa and the Congo is such a devastating and sad one, and it's the hidden story, really. We in the United States don't even talk about Africa. We don't think about Africa. Congo has something called coltan, which probably most of your listeners may not have even heard of, but every cell phone and laptop computer has coltan in it. And several million people in the last few years in the Congo have been killed over coltan because you and I and all of us in the G8 countries demand low, or at least we want to see our computers inexpensive and our cell phones inexpensive. And of course the companies that make these sell them on that basis, that, oh, here, mine's $200 less than the other company. But in order to do that, these people in the Congo are being enslaved. The miners, the people mining coltan, they're being killed. There's these vast wars going on to provide us with cheap coltan. And I have to say, if we want to live in a safe world, we must be willing, and in fact, we must demand that we pay higher prices for things like laptop computers and cell phones, and that a good share of that money go back to the people who are mining the coltan. And that's true of oil. It's true of so many resources that we are not paying the true cost. And there's millions of people around the world suffering from that. Roughly 50,000 people die every single day from hunger-related diseases and curable diseases that they don't get the medicines for, simply because they're part of a system that demands that they put in long hours and get very, very low pay so we can have things cheaper in this country. And Congo is an incredibly potent example of that.
So, we're seeing a new scramble for Africa that's already underway. There is, in the words of some commentators, a new window of opportunity in Africa, especially in the north. Though Europe itself remains Africa's biggest trading partner, Russia, Chinese, Turkish, and Arab Gulf patrons are willing to fill the geopolitical vacuum. Once again, Africa is being regarded as an empty continent upon which expansion can occur as if one is filling a vacuum. This isn't true, of course. There's nothing that's a vacuum about Africa, and it doesn't need to be filled. What we're talking about is new forms of extraction. And China is very much engaged in this kind of new form of extraction as part of their Great Belt and Road Initiative. In fact, China has learned from both European colonialism and the debt imperialism of American corporate globalization, and they've combined the two of them. Look for the needs of infrastructure, provide loans for that infrastructure, and then benefit from the repayment of those loans if they can be repaid, or if they can't, look for other forms of influence, including direct takeover of some of the infrastructure within the countries to which you've loaned significant amounts of money. This seems to be behind what's now taking place in Chinese investments. Let's take a look at this more closely.
It's January 2017 at the headquarters of the African Union here in Ethiopia. An IT engineer is looking at the servers in this building, and something seems off. The engineer notices that often in the middle of the night, these servers are connecting to some server in Shanghai and uploading emails and audio files. The African Union headquarters was built in 2012, but it was not paid for by any African nation.
The impressive new headquarters of the African Union, entirely funded by the Chinese government.
This building was a $200 million gift from the Chinese government. It was designed and built by Chinese firms with Chinese money. And yes, the servers were installed by Chinese engineers, who, it appears, left an intentional backdoor into the servers so that they were easily accessible. The African Union IT team eventually removed these Chinese servers and installed new ones. The Chinese government literally offered to install them for them, but they declined. The local IT people also swept the building, and they found microphones embedded in the furniture and in the walls. The whole building was bugged and had been feeding audio and internal emails to China for like 5 years since the building was built. China building a headquarters for the African Union and then spying on it is a pretty good symbol of what China is up to in Africa. And that's what this video is about. It's about how a growing China has rushed into Africa, mainly by building a bunch of stuff. Roads, trains, dams, mines, ports. These projects are a part of China's growth as a superpower. And it shows how this country is projecting its power on the continent of Africa.
But there are questions here over why the headquarters of such an important African organization is entirely the work of Chinese construction, labor, and money.
Okay, so there's this very predictable thing that you see time and time again as countries get powerful. As a country gets rich, they often start looking outward, both economically and militarily. Let me explain what I mean here. 50 years ago, China was a very poor country with a huge population. But eventually they opened up to the world. They opened up their huge population as a workforce for cheap labor, and their economy exploded.
China is agrarian, urbanizing fast, you betcha, but still agrarian.
Most in terms of land, not population.
Come on, Michael.
No, you're wrong about this.
So now China is a very rich country. And remember, rich countries start looking outward. How can they project their power, connect with other countries to continue their growth? They do this for a couple of reasons. The first one is the economic reason. In the same way that the US got really rich and prosperous and started to look outward to China for cheap labor, China also got rich. And its labor eventually got expensive, wages went up, and China needed its own option for cheap labor and new growth opportunities. So they started pouring huge amounts of money, like $300 billion huge, into Africa. Okay, so that's the economic reason. China grows really fast, their growth is slowing down, so they need to invest in emerging economies, is what the economists will call it. Economies that haven't developed very quickly yet, but that with a little bit of investment could start to grow. Untapped markets. But the economic explanation is only half the story here. In China, economics and government power are not very separate. So to understand what China is really up to, you have to understand the geopolitical motives. And to do that, we gotta look at a map. Here are all the countries that China has projects in. And yes, I've just highlighted every single country on the African continent. I mean, besides this one down here, this little tiny country of Swaziland, they're the one holdout on all of this. These projects range from transportation projects like roads and trains, to energy like oil and dams, to real estate projects like housing developments, and then mining for things like copper. You have everything from a shoe factory in Ethiopia, to a $6 billion Chinese-financed dam in Nigeria, to a massive suspension bridge in Mozambique, the longest in Africa. I mean, these projects are everywhere, even here on this tiny island off the coast, where China has poured millions of dollars to build housing, a stadium, an auditorium, a library, as well as their national parliament. China built it all. There are too many of these projects to even count. And honestly, if you take it as a whole, a lot of these projects have been a major benefit and economic stimulus to these countries' economies. But why is China doing this? What are they up to? Well, in addition to all the economic value of investing in emerging markets, China's president also claims that they're doing this in the name of cooperation and friendship.
坚持以非洲方式解决非洲问题。
The African way. Let's dig into this and actually see what these projects look like and how they are built, and if it truly is the African way, whatever that means. Okay, so there's this really impressive rail system that China built in Kenya. It goes from Nairobi to Mombasa in just under 4 hours, which is faster than any train in the United States, which, let's be honest here, isn't really saying much because here in the United States, we don't really know how to build trains anymore. We used to be really good at it and now we're not. And it's kind of a shame. And anyway, look at this train in Kenya. This railway system was a $3.6 billion project, the most expensive infrastructure project since Kenya's independence. And it was mostly entirely paid for by a giant loan from China's state-run bank. So it was financed by China, designed by Chinese engineers, and then built by Chinese construction firms that sent Chinese workers to hire locals and manage the project. And now it's a Chinese company that actually runs the thing. If you ride this train, you're gonna see all of the safety announcements and all of the documentation in Chinese, in Mandarin. It is very clear who financed and built this thing. It looks like China just parachuted in and plopped this thing down in Kenya. And now Kenya has billions of dollars of debt that they have to pay back to China eventually. In fact, 72% of all of Kenya's debt is owed to China. And this railway was meant to reduce congestion on the highway that runs parallel to it, but it hasn't done that. In fact, this railway cuts right through like these 2 national parks.
While the train will offer passengers a view of a lifetime while passing through the national park, conservationists are concerned that this construction will affect the ecosystem and the wildlife that live here.
And it's actually not doing what it said it was going to do. So yes, Kenya has this big shiny railway, but it wasn't really solving African issues in the African way. Meanwhile, the Chinese construction workers who came to build this thing were caught treating the local workers very poorly, making them sit at separate tables during meal breaks, punishing them when they didn't complete deadlines or take out the garbage on time. That mixed with the fact that some of these Chinese workers were taking bribes as a part of a huge corruption scheme with this railway. And it's clear that this project wasn't actually about supporting the local environment. It just left Kenya with a giant pile of debt and a big shiny railway. But listen, that's not always the case. There are tons of these projects and some of them are truly helping the locals, like this big, beautiful, shiny road here in Lesotho. This used to be a rough gravel road, and it is now a beautiful, shiny road that is helping the locals move around in their country. So it's definitely a mixed bag. And listen, I get it. China, you want to give a $5 billion loan to Nigeria to build a dam because Nigeria has 200 million people, many of them young, and you want to help them become a booming economy so that you can get in on some of that growth. Oh, and you love the fact that you don't have to adhere to any environmental standards while you're doing these projects, which I know you love, China. I know it. That's the business rationale. We're looking for new economies to invest in and be a part of their growth. But if you look a level deeper, you won't just see a bunch of investment projects. You'll see a bunch of free gifts from China. And I'm intrigued by especially the political ones. Like when China shows up and builds a new parliament building, which they've done for 7 countries in Africa. Or when China offers $32 million free dollars to build a new headquarters for ECOWAS, which is basically the economic union in Western Africa. They do this for free. We will build you a new headquarters. Well, let me be clear. There is no such thing as a free gift in international relations. Everything has strings attached. So a major part of all of this investment in Africa is China investing in its future as a global superpower who needs to have friends and has historically not had a lot of friends throughout the world because the big boy United States has been doing all the friending by giving people stuff and making their lives better so that they can be allies. So China is getting in on this. And China has used their checkbook to make friends with literally every single country in Africa. Of course, besides Swaziland, the teeny little country in the south that has been the one country that has held out on all of this. In funneling all of this money into these countries, China has been able to get all of these countries, besides Swaziland, to not recognize Taiwan anymore and to support China instead. The TLDR on that is that you can't support Taiwan and China because they both think that they're China, so you have to support one or the other, and so China has been getting everyone to denounce Taiwan and say that they support China. That's a whole other thing. I'm making videos about that. Suffice it to say that China has been using its checkbook to get all of these people to be their friends. It's sort of like the rich kid in middle school who like brings you an MP3 player because he wants you to be his friend, and you're like, sweet, if you give me your MP3 player, I'll be your friend. I grew up in the early 2000s. In my middle school, there were MP3 players, so sorry for the throwback. But remember when China built the African Union headquarters and then bugged the entire building so that they could spy on the leaders and their emails and their conversations? That is a perfect representation of the strings that are usually attached to these projects. But perhaps the less obvious but more dangerous strings attached are the debts. John Adams said it best when he said, quote, "There are two ways to conquer and enslave a country. One is by the sword and the other is by debt." It's a pretty intense quote, but it really applies here. So many of these projects have been paid for by Chinese money through loans. African nations diving deep into debt. We all know that when you owe someone money, that person has a lot of power over you, especially if you get to the point where you can't pay them back. And this isn't just theoretical. A few years ago, China helped Sri Lanka build a port here in the southeastern coast. It was done with a Chinese loan. With time, Sri Lanka struggled to pay back that loan. So in 2017, China swooped in and said, "Can't pay back your debt? No worries. Just lease us this port. Let us have it for 99 years. And Sri Lanka's like, that doesn't sound great, giving a piece of our sovereign territory to China, which they could potentially use for military, but we are in so much debt and they're offering to relieve some of that debt if we give them this port. Okay, so this port now belongs in part to China. This sets a dangerous precedent that could be applied to many of these nations in Africa who have sunk themselves deep into debt with China and may not be able to pay it back in the future. So China is growing and honestly behaving like any superpower would when they are growing this quickly. I mean, if we wanted to make a video about how the US has projected power throughout the years, it would be a lot worse of a video, okay? So let's just make it clear that China's a superpower, they're doing their superpower thing. This is very normal superpower behavior. Doesn't make it right, it just makes it very normal and typical. China has taken a specific interest in Africa, which has led to countless infrastructure projects, which have been, honestly, an impressive sight to behold, but has raised questions of what are the actual motives here. They're not just business and economic. And the bigger question that I want to keep an eye on going forward is, how is all this debt gonna play out? How will African nations who are so deeply indebted to China have to service that debt in the future? And what will happen if they can't pay it back? If we wanted to make a video about how the US has projected power throughout the years, it would be a lot worse of a video, okay? So let's just make it clear that China's a superpower, they're doing their superpower thing. This is very normal superpower behavior. Doesn't make it right, it just makes it very normal and typical. China has taken a specific interest in Africa, which has led to countless infrastructure projects, which have been, honestly, an impressive sight to behold, but has raised questions of what are the actual motives here. They're not just business and economic. And the bigger question that I want to keep an eye on going forward is, how is all this debt gonna play out? How will African nations who are so deeply indebted to China have to service that debt in the future? And what will happen if they can't pay it back?
It's these new forms of investment in infrastructure that worry the Western world a great deal these days, because these infrastructural investments are being made by China. Now, most of the current G7 nations invaded China in the year 1900, one after another. There was a put down of a rebellion, a Boxer rebellion there, inspired by a lot of European intervention. But now they're having to find themselves squabbling over access to trade with China, while China has the upper hand in moving into territories like North Africa and the southern areas. The G7 are scrambling, as they began in June of 2021, to consider how to counteract China and its infrastructural plan, the infra plan as they call it. This will be the new kind of dimension to the scramble currently taking place for Africa. In the future, we'll need to keep particular eye on agriculture and the way in which the scramble for resources, power, and control affects the way Africa can produce food for itself and for the wider world.